Welcome to the Raja Press Podcasts. I'm Firoz Manji. On this episode, we speak with Kirk J. James, author of 94A 6325.
The story of the carceral system, the story of the immigration system, the story of any type of marginalization, they're not separate stories. They're all interconnected. They're all, rooted in the same level of imperialistic racist violence that is America.
Coming of age in the era of mass incarceration. This is part 3 of a 3-part interview with Kirk J. James. It's an honor to have you on the show, dear Jay. The Raja Press will be publishing your outstanding book shortly. I would also like to introduce you to our 2 co-editors, Ayo Ogunremi and Russell Lamy, who are going to discuss your life, your book, and our journey together. Welcome, Ayo. Welcome, Russell.
Thanks, Rose. Hello. Great to be here.
Thank you. And thank you for that incredible introduction.
You're welcome. Talk about how your relationship with your family evolved across the different prisons that you're in, because obviously, like, initially you're in Rikers, not far from where you grew up, not far from New York City, whereas then you go upstate and it just gets harder for your family to come see you. So yeah, like, how is that playing into everything that you're experiencing at this point?
Yeah. So I was really blessed to have, a family, right? And I think that is something that for so many people that are incarcerated, many of them unfortunately have to, do those spaces by themselves. And, I'm extremely blessed that from Rikers Island to Coxsackie to Greene to Wyoming, my family was there. And it wasn't always just visits, it was phone calls. And I think the phone calls were exorbitant at that point, right? I think a 30-minute phone call could run upwards of $30, right? So imagine, calling your family a few times a week. So my family was incredible. Letters, my family was just so incredibly supportive. Heather, who is my daughter's mom, I remember Rikers obviously is a lot closer, right? Greene wasn't bad, but then when I went to like Wyoming, she would have to take a bus at midnight from the city that takes 7 hours to go upstate, right? To then spend 5-6 hours in a visitor room to then take a bus back 7 hours, right? So, like that, the level of commitment from my family, friends, and loved ones was really incredible. And the fact that, not only the fact, which made then the parole denials even tougher because I felt like, you know, I would have 3 parole denials through this process, right? And with each denial, it wasn't just for me. I felt more pain for them. I felt more pain that I would have to continue to subject them to this experience. Because at this point for me, not to say that I wasn't hurting, but I feel that I'd learned to survive. I'd learned to survive, and I was committed to survive it. And I was also aware, though, that this was creating a strain on my family and loved ones. So the denials felt like really hurtful, right? Like they hurt me in a deep way because, again, they couldn't understand. They really couldn't understand, like, why they're trying to deport you. Why wouldn't they let you out, right? So having to always like relive these things with my family were incredibly tough and incredibly challenging. But again, like I'm so fortunate to have had a family to really support me like in this system, right? Because again, there's no one that survives these systems without family, right? And it's and it was multitude of family, right? It was the family inside, the Blisses, the Pops, the Ninjas, but then it was also like my family outside. So again, there's so many people that are directly responsible for, like not only my survival, but my thriving post-incarceration.
These sources of connection clearly seem to be really important in terms of retaining a sense of humanization, like in the face of pervasive dehumanization.
And during your time, you partake in something called the Human Relations Therapeutic Program. And there's a part in which you're describing your participation where you're helping run this program, and a participant says something that I thought was really, really, really sharp and really hit me. And that was, the system is always talking about accountability, but who is going to be accountable to us?
Yeah.
What was it like hearing that? Like, what does that mean to you?
It makes me want to cry, if I'm being honest with you, because I think that, that was such a vulnerable space, right? And I felt so privileged that these men were able to like share with me their stories and, many of them the level of violence that they've experienced, right? And I just remember, that really shook me up because where does accountability start? And I think like we often there are places in the book I'm sure I'm ranting, but I'm just like, where does accountability start? And the people that always want to talk about accountability, it often starts, at a place that isn't fair. We can't talk about accountability for people in carceral systems if we're not talking about the historical violence they've been subjected to. And so that's always just like really stood with me because that program in particular, like many of those men were men who, were seen as some of the worst people in society, but when you heard their stories, you understood. You understood their pain, you understood their actions. And, what he was asking of me is something that I feel, I've taken and I'm asking of the system, right? Like, where does accountability start? Are you really willing to look at, like there's this Tupac song and he's like, yo, I think Meek Mill's sampled it. It's not even a song, but it's when he's coming out of court and he's like, America eats their babies, and he is like, like, and it's real, like, right? These systems are so violent. Tupac, for example, like he was born into a system. His mother was incarcerated. His mother was on Rikers pregnant with him, right? Had to, survive, the COINTELPRO, the violence against his family, had to survive like poverty, substance abuse, right? So it's like folks, by the time they get to the carceral spaces, have survived so much violence, and yet no one wants to honor or even see that, right? But they want them to be accountable to their acts of violence. And I don't think that is justice. I think justice can only happen when we're looking at this system as a whole.
And like, through all these difficult times, like, it's hard to believe that there's a possibility of like a good outcome or hope. But in 2001, you filed an appeal on your deportation order, and things look a little bit different. So can you walk us through what the appeal was like and how that ultimately ends?
Yeah, so like 2001, so even getting into 2001, right? There is two more parole denials, right? So there's a parole denial in 1999, which is devastating, right? The parole denial in 1999, because after parole denial in 97, right? Like the next parole was December 1999. So then to have another parole denial for the same reason was devastating. And then now 2001, I actually have 7 years in. So, right, like from 1994 to 2001, I didn't even think that I would do a year in prison, that somebody would have surely saw that there was a mistake somewhere. So now I have 7 years in and another parole denial at the beginning of the year, so 3 parole denials, right? So at this point, I'm also in Wyoming and I'm in a dorm with predominantly Caribbean people and predominantly people who are in the same situation as I am, have immigration warrants that are doing various levels of advocacy. And it was such a blessing because then, I felt like I just had greater wealth and access to information. So around this time, I hear of a case that went to the Supreme Court, St. Cyr versus INS. And I'll never forget this St. Cyr, right? And he had a similar case as mine, a criminal possession case, and he argued to the Supreme Court that the 1996 immigration laws should not have been held retroactive, and thus that his order of deportation should be reversed. And he ultimately won. And so what this meant was that I would be able to do something similar. So I remember, putting together the appeal, which I did myself. I'd studied the law by this point. I was a regular in the law library, and with the help of a few friends in the dorm, I put together my own appeal. So this is probably like summer 2001. So then fast forward to September, and I was actually teaching an HRTP on September 11th, 2001. And I remember I'm teaching a class, and then we get the announcement that we needed to go back to the dorm. So I remember that morning was commissary. So I was excited to go to commissary. I'm kind of like aggravated, like, why are we going back to the dorm? And so I remember being on the walkway, and like there were all types of conversations happening. People are talking about planes like flew into like buildings in Manhattan. It all sounded so wild. And I remember getting back to a dorm, and everyone is just around the TV. They were watching the events of 9/11 unfold. And I remember just, being like stunned like everyone else. I remember, going to the phones to try to call to make sure that, my family was okay. At the time, Heather, my daughter's mother worked in the area, so I was really like worried about her. And, so for a few days, the phones were not working. And, so there was so much anxiety. And ultimately, I was able to get in contact with her. She was okay. But then, like 2 days or 3 days after 9/11, I get mail, and I found out that my case was reopened, my immigration case was reopened. So, it just felt like there'd been so many defeats, 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 that September 2001 was the first time where I felt like, "Oh my god," like, "Wow, there's, a light possibly at the end of the tunnel," because I was really becoming resigned to maybe I would not get out of prison. And think about how wild this is that I was arrested at 18. Now, 7 years later, I'm like 25, 26, right? And I'm almost like have lost hope that I would ever get out of prison. And so when I won the right to have my immigration case reopened, this was really huge. And I would have a hearing and ultimately have my immigration case reopened, and would be able to put together a team. And there was a immigration attorney that I would speak to on three-way, which was illegal, but my aunt would call him up, like, and just he ran an immigration hotline, Manny Vargas. And I would just always ask him questions, and we began to build a relationship. So when I got my immigration case reopened, I remember calling him and saying like, "Hey, I won this case. I got my case reopened." And he actually volunteered to represent me pro bono. So that was like, again, that was like my second win. So then I was able to have this really experienced immigration attorney and his law intern at that time, Kevin Lapp, begin to work on my case. And what they would do over a period of months was really speak with my family, collect evidence, letters, which would then be presented in my immigration hearing, which was called a 212C hearing, which is a waiver hearing. It no longer exists, but it existed as a relief for people who had been convicted of crimes. And it was a humane way for the court to kind of like see you and to see the mitigating factors, right? Not just your charges, but to really see you as a human being, to see your family, to see the mitigating factors. And so I was able to have a hearing at downstate in January 2002 or February 2002, and I ultimately won. So then this was like my third win, right? So I actually won my immigration case, and so from 1996 to 2002, almost 6 years, I'd been fighting this order of deportation, and I finally won in 2002. When I won that, that's when I feel I kind of saw the door opening, right? So that there was a possibility of a light at the end of the tunnel.
You're listening to the Daraja Press podcast. Daraja is the Kiswahili word for bridge. As its name suggests, Daraja Press seeks to build bridges, especially bridges of solidarity between and amongst movements, intellectuals, and those engaged in struggles for a just world. Check out our other episodes, books, and more at darajapress.com. So now let's get back to the show.
And speaking of light at the end of the tunnel, shortly after you have your fourth parole hearing, and even just walking the door, like the vibe seems totally different from the first three parole hearings. So what changed, and how were you received at that fourth parole hearing?
Yeah. So let me back up a little bit, right? So, I win the immigration case. It's like probably January, February. In May, I get my college degree, which I get my associate's degree, which is like incredible, right? Like, at a point where there's no education in these spaces to have this college program, to be able to earn an associate's degree was so incredible, right? So it's like, it's not only, I feel like, I went from losing, losing, losing to now I'm like, yo, I'm winning, right? I've actually, I've won my immigration case. I've just gotten my college degree. So I'm really feeling good now. I'm really starting to feel like there's a possibility. So I'm preparing to go to my fourth parole board, which would be then in February 2003. So in December, in Wyoming, there is all of a sudden like a lot of movements. But for me, I'm not expected to be moved because I'm going to the parole board in 2 months. And usually when you go into the parole board in like 2, 3 months, there is no movement. And then also I have a college hold because I'm in college. So I'm not expecting any type of movement. I'm expecting to complete like my fourth parole board probably in Wyoming. And I remember it was the day after Christmas, and, the CO, he stops by my cube and he says, like, "Pack up." I was like, "Pack up? What do you mean?" And so I pack up and I go to the draft room and they're like, "You're going to Arthur Kill." And to put this in context, right? Like, so all the state prisons at this time, they're all like hundreds of miles away from New York City. Arthur Kill is the only state prison that is in New York City. It's actually, people don't consider Staten Island New York City before Wu-Tang, but it's actually like on Staten Island. So it's in New York City. It had been like urban lore, right? Nobody goes to Arthur Kill. So for me, all of a sudden, like to have, like I'd been in all these horrible prisons, and right now I'm by like the Canadian border. So to pack up to go to Arthur Kill was just really weird. But I remember, just the excitement of like, my God, I'm going back to New York City after being away for like 9 years, right? Even though I'm still incarcerated, I'm going back to New York City. And I remember, like, just crossing the Tri-Bar Bridge, which is, like, a bridge that kind of, it's probably the point where you separate going upstate New York from New York City. And I remember crossing the Tri-Bar Bridge, and, like, we picked up Hot 97, and there's Cam and Jay-Z's Welcome New York City, like, came on. I was just like, "My God." I just, like, really burst out into tears. Like, it was such a, even to this day, when I hear this song, I still feel like that, like it was so beautiful to get back to New York City. And so I remember getting into Arthur Kill, and whenever you go to a new jail, they have to do an intake interview. And so the CO, like that's doing the intake interview, he says, "Do you know why you're here?" I know, I don't know why I'm here, right? And he's like, "You're going home, don't fuck up." And it's like, "What?" People say the system is rigged, don't ask me, right? But, like, he literally says to me, he's like, but I couldn't believe him, right? Like, because that's too vulnerable. I would make myself too vulnerable. I just got 3 parole denials, right? So, I want to believe, but I can't believe him. So I remember, like the rumors were that, the parole board in Arthur Kill was, a lot better than the other places. And so I remember going to the parole hearing, and as soon as I got into the parole hearing, it was just different. It was really different. It was the first time that I felt like seen. I felt like it was the first time somebody was actually like really willing to see my humanity. And I didn't know if I was gonna make the parole board or not, but I know I felt good, like, being seen as a human being and being seen in, like, my totality. And, the conversation was just, like, radically different than any other conversation that I ever had with the parole board. And, I just felt like leaving that hearing that, like, again, I felt in my soul, my spirit, I knew that I was home.
No, like that's the first time in almost a decade where the system sees you as a human being.
Yeah.
So for the weight of that to really land, like
Yeah,
it's
I share in the book,
so
right? And there's this irony because there's this white woman who was a parole commissioner, and I remember she just sat next to me, like, before the hearing started, right? And she was like, "I can't believe that you've been denied parole 3 times." And, um, whew, I just remember, like, it felt, like, so disorienting, like, to have had that experience where, like, no one sees you and to have an experience where, like, I was armored up, like, the parole board, you gotta armor up. So I felt, like, discombobulated, like, "Oh my god, stop, I'm gonna cry," like, I need to armor up for this. But I didn't need to, right? Like, I didn't need to, and I don't know who that woman was. I've never even looked at the papers to see who she was, but, like, if she ever sees this, I'm grateful, like, I'm grateful, I think the system is horrible, and it's, really inhumane, but I'm grateful that that day, like, they were willing to see me, and I hope that, for everybody that reads this book, that's really, like, my goal is that we're curious about people behind numbers, behind labels, right? Like we're willing to, really understand that everyone has a story. Everyone is, no one is just a number. We're talking about like mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, sons, and it's our duty if we're ever going to create a world that has justice, right? That it has to start with our willingness to see people.
Yeah. It's interesting, I guess, like this fourth parole involves this like kind of beginning of your, you could say, rehumanization. And you then begin this process of, like, you describe it as re-entry. And you talk about like this myth of rehabilitation as a goal of the carceral system and what that taught you about like the necessity of abolition. So can you yeah, just talk about what that process was like?
Yeah, well, I think again, for me coming home, right? For me coming out of prison, I didn't think that I was free. And it wasn't because I didn't have enough rights or whatever. It was just really that understanding that I knew that we couldn't be free. I couldn't be free unless we were all free. I really understood what the system is. I understood that the risks that, having 3 brothers at home, having, a black son, I really understood that this is not a system that is reformable. This system is doing exactly what it was intended to do. One of my mentors, Eddie Ellis, always says that, he has this thing that he would say is like, McDonald's always brags about billions served, right? Imagine 70% of those billions were returned, would McDonald's still be in business? And so we have a carceral system that returns, 70% of people continually, right, that live in this loop and never goes out of business because that is the business. So for me, it wasn't about like, how do I make this system more humane? How do I reform the system? No, the only option is how do we like destroy the system? How do we re envision human engagements? How do we re envision accountability, right? And it doesn't mean that people won't create harm or, we won't have to at certain points maybe, like remove people from society, but it's really understanding that the carceral system that exists right now is predicated on racism, it's predicated on anti-blackness, and it's predicated on capitalism and the exploitation of black and brown bodies. And if we're going to do something different, it begins with that like recognition and a willingness to really, really, really rethink what justice is.
And just last question, sort of bring this to the present. Like we live in a time right now where we're seeing like mass expansion of incarceration, but this time maybe immigrant detention as opposed to just more typical forms of detention. So what do you think 94A 6225 can tell us about the times that we're living through now and what lesson can we carry forward?
Yeah, well, one of the things I always talk about is that, there are no single issues, right? I think so often in America, We don't see like even this idea of immigration, right? No one asks like, why are people coming to America? I know for me, I didn't want to come to America, right? Like I love Jamaica. I love growing up in Jamaica. And no one really, again, thinks about like how American foreign policy is like destabilizing countries throughout the world. And I know what American foreign policy, like what we're witnessing right now, like the imperialistic violence being perpetuated by the United States, by Israel, right? I know what that feels like. I come from a country that was destabilized. So I really understand what that feels like. I understand what coming to America and being subjected to racism feels like, being subjected the communities that are marginalized, that are over police feels like, right? I know how easy it is for young people to get caught up in the carceral system or to get caught up in behaviors that are criminalized. So for me, again, 94A6325 is, a calling for people to think about like why are we labeling immigrants as criminals, right? Like why are so many people like fleeing their countries and how can we really create like a system of equity, right? Not only in America but throughout the world, because when you look at like so many of these countries that are considered democratic, what they've really done is not democracy. It's not like it's not justice, it's not liberation, it's exploitation, it's domination. And so for many of these things that like we're seeing happening right now, they're not new. I often say to people that, like what's happening with ICE, it's happening because many people turn a blind eye to the carceral genocide. These militarized policing has been happening in our communities for decades now, right? And many people have turned a blind eye to that. So these aren't separate stories, right? The story of the carceral system, the story of the immigration system, the story of any type of marginalization, they're not separate stories. They're all interconnected. They're all, like rooted in the same level of imperialistic racist violence that is America.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a powerful way of like wrapping it all up. And I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us. And it's been such a pleasure both talking to you today, but also reading your story. I think it's a wonderful story. And I think people will really, really feel these things that you're describing when reading it as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Could I say one
Absolutely.
last thing, right? So I want to really say shout out to Daraja, shout out to Feroz, shout out to you all, right? As someone who believes that, a big part of this moment is our ability to empower impacted people to tell their stories, right? Like I believe people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but often furthest from the resources. And, my experience even, shopping this story is that a lot of people who profess this, right? They're not really about that. They're really about like wanting to exploit or really wanting to package stories in a certain way in which they feel that could be marketable. So I just want to say that this is a time, right, where we're seeing journalism compromise in so many ways that we have to like really honor like, independent presses, not-for-profit presses, people who are really like standing true to like collective liberation right now. So I think just I really want to say that and honor you all for like supporting this story because this is what we all have to do now in this moment. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay, for those comments. But really, it's to thank you for what you have helped all of us realize some aspects of our own humanity. I have one question to ask, and this is directed at Io and Russell. You've read this book, you've done so much editing and so on. What was your reaction to this book?
As soon as I picked up the book, I couldn't put it down. It's a roller coaster emotionally and like narratively. I think the book is really, it's harrowing in many ways just because of how easy it is, I feel, to put yourself, or at least it was for me, to put myself in Jay's shoes. It's a period in time that I have like some relatively decent familiarity with, and that being like the US, New York in the 90s, throughout the 90s. I just never really had the perspective of what that was like as in this narrative form from a young Black person. Like I know a lot of, I grew up listening to like Wu-Tang and Nas, so I knew the music, but I didn't really know the reality so well. Like for it to see, so to see the life of an individual young Black man caught up in like the mass incarceration, the carceral genocide, and to see like how just to get this in such an embodied way that I could really relate to myself. Yeah, like the book really is like no other, I think, in that way. The blending of all these different, both like cultural events, so the music, like the OJ chase, 9/11, Lauryn Hill, the crime bill, the immigration laws, like these are all many things that like many of us have heard about, and seeing Jay's life like just cut through all of these events from the position of being so unjustly incarcerated throughout, like pretty much the entire 90s. It just really stayed with me.
Russell.
I would say like the word embodied, I really agree with that, and that really resonates with me. Because like I was saying, like as a young Black man myself, like I know the ways in which this world wants to strip your humanity away, and it wants to put you in a box, and it wants to deny you the same rights that other people have and the same open-mindedness to your full humanity. So to read such like a vivid account of like what that's like to have that so violently taken away from you, like for me it was deeply impactful. Like I felt really connected to your experience while reading through it. And I'm 27 now. Like I'm around the age you were when you finished your bid after 9 years. So for me, like my entire adult life, there's so much wrapped up in like how I perceive my entire adult life. So for that to be behind bars in this violent system day in, day out, like for me, like I was like really, really emotional reading some of those like more difficult sections, be it just seeing the daily violence that you're subjected to, both between prisoners, but the system itself, as well as like the ways in which you're just denied any sort of recognition or any sort of option for being a full human being who has done some things that we're not proud of, but has also in many ways like been part of a broader system, and it's not just your position in that. So for me, like embodied really captures like what that experience was like. And I really feel like I got to know someone like really well just reading it, and I'm very grateful for them.
Yeah, I think I'd like to sort of emphasize that this is apparently a book about you, but that it's a huge gift to all of us. And it is about your struggle to reclaim your humanity. And that is a struggle all of us are engaged in. And so thank you for what you've done, Jay. Extraordinary. Well, this is a joint publication between Daraja Press and Mark Media, and I look forward to the next volumes. This is just volume 1. So thank you for this gift, Jay, and for a really excellent, very, very interesting interview. I could sit here all day and listen to it as well. But thank you, Russell. Thank you, Ayub. And above all, thank you, Jay.
Thank you all. I'm so privileged and honored to be part of this moment, this community, and again, just eternally grateful for the support.
You were listening to an interview with Kirk J. James, author of 94A 6325, Coming of Age in the Era of Mass Incarceration. It is available at Daraja Press shortly. You can pre-order it now. You can find it along with other important books on our website at darajapress.com. That was the final installment of our 3-part interview with Kurt J. James. This episode was produced by Pierre Loisel, music by Arlo Maverick. I'm Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Thank you for listening.